Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this one we're going to talk about shadowing and rendering. So what I like to do is first start with some basic ideas. Uh, I'm just going to draw a portion of an arm, a leg, and we'll render those because it's a lot of what you're going to be doing when you draw a comic art anyways, but it can apply to all sorts of things. And forgive my little glitch there, I updated my system and now it drops in a little bit of text as I'm drawing. It's not a big deal, but it's maybe a little distracting, so I want you to be aware of it. But essentially, when we go to shadow anything, it's really a similar idea of creating basic ideas of where the light's emanating and hitting, where it's bouncing and hitting elsewhere. So I think that when we go to draw characters, there's a lot to consider, right? A lot of different volumes and shapes and a lot of areas it could be bouncing from. So, and then you get into stylistic choices as well. So there's just a lot to consider, and I think that's why it can get really super confusing rather quickly. But what we'll do is we'll just draw some basic, uh, models basically to work from. That's all this is. I'm just constructing some models that we can shadow and play around with. You see I'm using the basic cylinder structure. You don't have to do that. I like to. It just gives me a little bit of idea where these directions and volumes are going. And then I can drop anatomy over top. So I've got other lessons on that. And again, that's not really what today's lesson's about, but I figured I would show you the process and the build up just because. And so that'll give us a basic arm to work with. And then you can get in here and erase some of your cylinder drawings and stuff like that. Scale up this brush, get that out of there. And so we'll start with this one first, and then in the next lesson I'll do a portion of a leg, and we'll use different shading methods for each area. Maybe even incorporate a little bit of suit designs. I'll probably do separate lessons on just suit designs. That's been requested more than once. So, and always remember that reach out, let me know what lessons you want to know specifically, and I will get those on my list. So with this, we've got a series of shapes now to work with. And so again, with anatomy, it can get tricky because there's, you could consider each shape individually, but you kind of need to do that as well as think of the entirety of the arm, leg, whatever it is, full character, right? So if you get too awfully confused by each area, or maybe focused on each area, so you do this area, this area, this area, this area, right? It can look really segmented and kind of weird. Now, some styles, it looks really cool nonetheless. I mean, it really does play into a couple of things. And again, I think that's why it can be somewhat confusing, because sometimes it breaks all the rules and looks really cool because of style. I think that generally, if you have a more overly stylistic, interpretative thing going on, so lots of hard angles, lots of dramatic caricaturizations in the work, then you could probably get away with even more stylized shadowing and rendering as well, because it just sort of like plays into the whole cartooning role of it all. It's like, that's definitely not realistic, so what does it matter? So where if you have a more realistic depiction of your characters, then maybe people sort of expect the light and shadow to be realistic as well. I don't think that's a rule. I'm just sharing with you my opinions about why that might, people might expect a certain thing, like a certain directional pursuit to what you're doing. But so we've got this arm in place, and say we, just pick an area where the light source is. And so I like to use a dimensional kind of representation. You could do something like this. I'll see this one done quite a bit. And so what it does is, since you can see the three-dimensional shape of the arrow, it makes you realize that, we're sort of closer to the viewer at this point. Where if I was to do something like this, you don't know if that arrow's, further away on the other side, closer to us. There's no orbital way to kind of depict that. Until you do something like this, you could put the orbit there. That's a little bit easier to discern as well. But you can see that this one now would actually reside somewhere over here, just higher up. But as far as the orbit's concerned, and this matters because if you don't think of the light in a very spherical way, just like your subject matter, in this case just a basic arm, then obviously you're going to falter as you apply the light source. So what I would perceive is that at this point, this light is emanating down like this, and it is hitting, we'll say, at the highest point, you got to think about the bicep area going around like this, right? Well, it has what I would consider an apex in relationship to the light, which would be probably right about there. So we could start with that concept. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to be able to focus in on that all the way through, but at least if I start there, I can say, okay, let's say the highest point of the muscle that it's hitting right there is that little plus sign, and that's our peak of our light source. Well, now we can start to shadow, and we really got a great idea of how this might shadow. So I'm going to start with a single light source on this particular one. So say I shape the bicep like this, okay? And one of the things I like to think about as I shadow anything really is how much width, how much depth, how big is the volume of that area. So if I put this line, for instance, if I take this line and I go, for one, if I go like this, I mean, that just really kind of kills the shape of it almost entirely. It flattens it out a bit. It doesn't entirely because this side over here drops down. So it actually, in some ways, actually works pretty well for the bicep because the bicep does have a difference of width as it goes around like this. And so thinking about that and getting that in with your initial shape of shadow works out really well. So I might take this and cut this way and drop down this way and bring it, and I try a few different shapes. And obviously if I'm looking at reference, I can pull from that, but I like to draw stylistically, as you probably know if you follow my lessons. And so I just play around with some of these shapes, but I make sure to get the difference in width and the implication or implied volume as I move around that form. And that needs to happen really to every muscle group, but that's something I do think about. So I'm going to try something like this. And if the height and sort of, not really the apex, but the apex of where the light would hit is right about there, then I have to perceive that as it gets down to this muscle that's behind it, this tricep that's on the back of the arm, that it wouldn't be the same idea. So if I took the shadow here and I tried to relate that down to here, I might do something like this. And it's probably not bad, but I don't know, I just kind of envisioned that now we're further away from the light source, and so I'd probably need to do something more like that. So it need to have more shadow down here, not less. And again, that's a little bit of a guesstimation. I don't know that to be a fact. I'm just saying that that's how I perceive it. And so here we've got this smaller muscle group. Really, I just feel like this would catch a lot less light anyway, so I'm going to do something like that. Here, maybe you get a little bit of light right there. And by the way, this is a more darkly lit model at this point when you're putting these heavier shadows. Another thing that I like to think about when I go to light a character, model, whatever, is what percentage of shadow do I want in this? Sometimes I like to darkly light the model just because it pops more in a particular scene, especially if there's a lot of surrounding details. Then I think heavier shadows works better because it makes the character stand out really well. Obviously mood is a big one, the biggest really, like how dramatic is the scene, what is the mood of the scene, things like that. So as we get over to here, again, we think about this initial point right there, the bicep, and that peak of the light source, and we come over here and say, well, this is going to actually catch a lot of light now, so maybe just a smaller shadow there for that bit of definition, the muscles on the thumb side, we can say that over here it's going to get a pretty large shadow. Now another thing that I do, and it's a little bit of a style choice, is I do these little points going into the smaller either divides of muscle or direction of the muscle. It's kind of tricky because I think that if you do it too much, like lots of little triangles, lots of little points, it can get overdone really quickly and it can start to look like broken glass or something. So I do a little bit of it, but I try to be careful to not go too awfully crazy with it. You really want to play around with some more organic shapes as well. Like you don't want to go too angular, too organic. You want to find a nice mix. I also feel like there's a little bit of shadow from this tendon, so the bicep connects down through here and you get this visible tendon. Usually if somebody's kind of flexing their arm, this kind of looks and feels like a flex position. So those are the base shadows that I would do, and I would just continue on with this. So again, play around with a mix of angular and organic shapes. And also, if you're a little bit more new to this, lean a little bit more heavily into angles. Angles are generally easier to work with at first. That's why you'll see a lot of cartoon-like styles that use real heavy angles. And it also, to me, it's a little bit more of a design approach, designed way of thinking. You know, you got to figure, like if you were to rough out a city and a building, you start very structural, very angular, right? It's easier to map perspective. It's easier to map size of spatial relationships, all this stuff. So just use that to your advantage. If you're a little bit more new to this, be okay with some more heavy angles. You can always go back and make things look a little bit more organic after you do sort of the design phase of what you're doing. So we're going to stop here. We're going to go to the next lesson. We're going to fill these shadows in, talk more about this, and get to some rendering. So with that, let's move on to our next lesson.